Kate Mulefalcher. Welcome to Irish Granny Helen. Welcome to all my returning subscribers. Welcome if you're a new subscriber. I think anybody who's been watching my channel for a while knows I kind of have a affinity for history, and it's impossible for me to not draw connections between experiences from the past and the knowledge we should retain in the present. And, it's July, and I was looking at a retrospective calendar of events that happened in July throughout human history. And my eyes immediately went to the Albigensian Crusade. I hope I said that right. It's named after a place. It's also known as the Cathar Crusade. And we're going to talk about that today because I think it is an object lesson in how people allow themselves to be consumed by their ideology, and eventually it deteriorates to demonizing people who do not agree with their ideology. And this is an example of what can happen. And I think that, those lessons need to be learned. We need to be reminded of them. I'm sure this is not a common subject at most people's dinner tables anyway. This was the Fourth Crusade. So let's look at this. Now, Crusade was kind of a military project that was led by the Pope. They were often called at pertinent times in relationship to other historical events because they served as a way to distract dissatisfied populations that are maybe rumbling a little bit in resistance to the authorities. And a good healthy crusade would keep them busy, send them away and keep them busy. And so they would send them on this religious foray to, well, crusade comes from the Latin for cross. So, they were onward Christian soldiers is basically where that phrase comes from. And they were going to take care of the heathens or the pagans or the dissidents or whatever. This is the Fourth Crusade, and it was definitely against heretics, because these people that they went after actually considered themselves Christian. They were just a different kind. So it began officially in July of 1209, and it went on into April of 1229. So it was 20 years. It wasn't just one event. It was a continuing project of violence. So technically, it's a military ideological campaign. It was begun by Pope Innocent III. Not so innocent. He wanted to eliminate Catharism. Now, I've done videos before on the Cathars. I find them really, really fascinating. The word Cathar, it actually comes from the Greek. It means pure or clean. They originated, people think, from the Bogomils, who were a group of Gnostics, a sect of Gnostics in the early Christian church in the Baltic region. And it moved, across Europe. The Gnostics, I've done a whole lot of videos on them, and there's a playlist. There are a couple of playlists, actually. Gnosticism as a whole ideology that sprang way before Christianity, way before. There are Gnostics of all stripes, pagan Gnostics, Muslim Gnostics, Jewish Gnostics. When you do a Venn diagram of all the religions, there's an intersection where they kind of all agree to some extent or other that the material world is a distraction, an illusion, a burden, depending on which belief system. The goal is essentially with all of them, you want to get away from the weight and burden of the material world, ego, identification with things, and you want to move towards fully processing the understanding that we have the spark of the creator in us, the source, that we are of the source, part of the source, therefore part of each other, and that our purpose is to make that journey away from the material world, bring ourselves to gnosis, an understanding, a knowledge of who we really are, and therefore fulfilling our purpose in this incarnation. And that journey is the same journey for everybody, but different for everybody. It's the same distance from the material world to the source. But depending on who you are, you're carrying the weight of your past experience in this life, your karma from previous lives, and a lot to work through to get from there to where we're supposed to end up, which is unity with the source. And the Cathars rejected conventional early Christianity, and that wasn't real popular with the powers that be, as you can possibly imagine. They were dualistic. They believed that God is good, God is pure spirit, God is just another word for source, and that there is a thing called the demiurge, which is the physical world, the evil, the thing that holds us back from union and knowledge of the source. And it keeps us mired in what they called Rex Mundi, the king of the world, the material world, the chaotic. So they believed in what is ascribed to Jesus as the teachings of Jesus, but they believed that all of these accounts were allegorical, and that an angel or God, that Jesus was either that, an angel, or he was God, or he was love, order, peace, but not truly physical, that these stories were allegories in the same way that the messages of Aesop's fables resonate for everybody, but the fox and the grapes were not really talking to each other. That's in a similar sense. These stories of the life of Jesus are meant to be symbolic, allegorical. They believed that people originally had no souls, and God took pity on them and gave them souls, and that didn't go down really well with the conventional Christian church. They believed in the transmigration of souls, reincarnation. That was voted against by the early church. But here's the big issue. This is my opinion right now, I believe why they ran afoul of the Pope. They believed he had no authority. They believed civil and papal authority, clergy authority, that had no claim on them. They refused to take oaths of allegiance to anything. They refused to participate in military service. They were vegetarian. They did not kill animals. They believed that all clergy, including the Pope, were corrupted and unworthy. That kind of put them at odds. They also didn't see a need for clergy. They believed that anybody could consecrate a Eucharist or hear a confession, put everybody on the same par, same level playing field. They didn't believe in transubstantiation, which is the notion that during the religious ceremony of the Mass in the Catholic Church, which was what was there at the time, they believed that the wine and the bread, the host, become the body and blood of Jesus. And Cathars didn't believe that. They didn't believe in purgatory. When they got together, they took turns being in charge. So they would draw lots to see who was going to be bishop or deacon of the day, I guess. They did not believe in baptism. They did a laying on of hands, which they called the consolamentum. And this act was usually done right before death, if there was time. They believed that water was unclean because it had been corrupted by the earth. And therefore, they just laid on hands. Once you had this consolamentum, you were called a perfectus, which in Latin means, perfect. Your soul could escape the cycle of reincarnation. That's the goal here, is to not have to come back, to unify with the source. By the 12th to the 13th centuries, they had a substantial following. Albi was a town in a place called Languedoc, which was near what is today Toulouse in France. And it was a sort of a closed community, closed in the sense that most of the people there were not related by blood, by DNA history to other people in the area. They were more closely related to Catalan. They didn't consider themselves part of France. They felt no allegiance to the King of France. They felt no allegiance to the Pope. They had no authority over this group of people. Around them was a loose group of many local lords, like landowners. And these lords all considered themselves unified as part of the Kingdom of France. And everybody got along. Everything was fine until this crusade was declared by Pope Innocent. By 1209, the population in the area of Albi, Languedoc, was about 35,000. And they were very prosperous. They had money, they had influence, they had a high level of political autonomy, and that's the real problem. It was an urbanized area. These were not rural peasant farm workers. This was very urbanized. They had defensive architecture, in other words, big walls to protect them. They had built this town on top of what was left of an old Roman settlement. They felt little or no discrimination against the Jewish people in their area. They lived peacefully side by side. At this time, it's kind of hard to picture this, but the north and the south of France were like two completely different countries. And I have never been to France, but what I've read is that the south of France, Provence, is quite different than northern France. So I think that might still prevail in a different way, but still. The Cathars were prominent amongst the Catholics of the area, but they were still a minority. They were calling all the time for a reform of the church. They didn't like the clergy. They considered themselves Catholic, which was Christian. Just astounds me. When I first moved to this little town I'm living in, it was the first time ever in my life somebody said to me, well, Catholics are not Christian. I was like, what? I was surprised. I think it's a lack of historical understanding. It's true that the Catholic Church didn't formally create, that central kernel of Catholicism until about 200 years or so after the death of Christ. But it took all these people that identified as Christians under its wing. So it's the same thing. The Cathars were considered dissidents. They were a problem for the powers that be. They were becoming more and more popular as a mass movement against the corruption of the clergy and papal power. You know, the clergy they were very hypocritical. The Pope, I mean, we could go on and on and on about the power of the Pope and the position of the Pope and the behavior of different popes. But they called it as they saw it. And the Pope didn't like it. And there was growing animosity on the part of the Vatican against the Cathars. And they would have conflicts in isolated areas. There would come to a head, and a Cathar or two would be burned at the stake. And then things would settle a little bit. It didn't stop them, but it sort of was like a pressure valve, and then it would start up again. In 1176 and again in 1179, the church had the Lateran Council. This was a church council to develop policy, I think is probably the easiest way to describe it. They would vote on, okay, this is what we're going to believe, and this is what we expect, and this is what privileges the clergy has, and this is the obligations of regular people. And one of the things they declared was Cathars were heretics. It was challenging their authority. In this particular area in France, there was an air of laxity and acceptance of nonconformist religious movements. Kind of a live and let live attitude. Nobody was forcing, well, the different religious sects were not forcing their own beliefs on each other. But the central power back there in Rome didn't agree. By 1198, Pope Innocent III was mad that the Cathars were not showing the proper respect for authority for the king and the church. And it's especially because the Cathars were protected by local nobles who had their own agenda. They wanted to be independent from the king. So you have all these lords who are big landowners, knights. And on the surface, they declared loyalty to the King of France. But the truth was, they kind of liked the idea of autonomy. And the Cathars were very vocal about their belief in autonomy and their disrespect for the king. And it kind of gave the nobles a little permission or courage to develop their sense of a rejection of authority. And the Pope saw this coming, didn't like it. In 1204, the Pope offered an indulgence to all these lords. So here's a way of bringing them back into the fold and rewarding them for working for him, and then getting his biggest critics out of the picture at the same time. So the indulgence is like religious brownie points is all I could think of to describe it. He said, okay, we're going to create this military campaign, and we're going to put a stop to these dissidents. But the problem was, a lot of these lords were not around. They were busy fighting with England. There was a battle with England going on at the same time. One of the most powerful nobles in this area of Albi, the Cathars, he was hostile to the Pope's offer. He was flat out not interested in supporting the king, supporting the Pope. Wasn't a Cathar, but he was independent. And the Pope turned around and excommunicated him. Oh my goodness. And unfortunately, that meant that they took his land. It's hard to imagine how much power they had, but they had a lot of power. Then the Pope, he tried sending Cistercian monks to convert the Cathars. And so he got these monks together and sent them out to France and, go set these people straight. And they had very little luck. It didn't work. So after his emissary to the region was killed, so he sent a guy out to represent him with these monks. And there was pushback, and this guy was killed. And that did it. That was the last straw for Pope Innocent III, and he called for a crusade against the Albi area, hence Albigensian crusade. This is the Fourth Crusade. And before I say the next thing that the Pope said, I want to just be clear for the sake of YouTube that these are not my words, and I don't believe this. These are the words of Pope Innocent III in the early 1200s against the Cathars. He said he wanted to free Europe from heresy to better defend the borders against invading Muslims. So they were in the middle of an historical situation where people were pushing from the east, and now they had dissension from within. So this was not good for the Pope. So at the same time, there were two other crusades going on in different parts of the Holy Land, number 5 and number 6. So the first group of armed crusaders that he sent out, about 10,000 of them, were mostly from northern France. And they weren't all French. Some of them were English, some of them were Austrian. They were headed by the abbot of the Cistercian monastery. So I looked it up. I was curious, and it's still there. He was the abbot of the monastery, the abbey. I think it's pronounced Citeaux. And today even they have 35 monks still there. They make cheese, caramels, and honey candy. They weren't so sweet when this abbot led 10,000 armed, like a paramilitary, a militia, against these ordinary people just because they didn't like their belief system. And this abbot, this holy religious man, ordered the slaughter of the entire population of a number of different towns. He's famous for what he said. It's attributed to the wrong person often, and it's misquoted. But essentially, in French, he said, he was asked by one of the military leaders, well, how do we know, who's a Cathar and who isn't? He said, just kill them all. God will know his own. It's been quoted as saying, kill them all and God will sort them out. But truly, that's not what he said. He said, God will know his own. They killed 20,000 people in one day, including clergy who went to the cathedral to claim sanctuary. They were killed on the altar. Sanctuary was a claim of protection. If you could get yourself into a church and get up to the sanctuary, nobody would kill you. But apparently it didn't hold. Many towns surrendered, and there was whole scale. I don't want to say too many of the words that apply to this because YouTube doesn't like them, but just you can imagine why they were there and what they did when they were there. Other towns, when they knew they were coming, they evacuated. They took to the forests and the hills. At a place called Carcassonne, they marched the entire population out of town, many naked or in their underwear. So they were rampaging through the town first, and marched these people into the Pyrenees, and most of them became refugees. While they were refugees, trying to get their lives into some sort of condition after this terrible trauma, they were hunted down by the Inquisition. The Inquisition, they even went so far as to unbury the dead and burn them at the stake. And of course, that's how they treated anybody who refused to recant and say, okay, we were right, we were wrong, and you guys are right. The lands and property of the people who were rounded up, this might sound very familiar, were given as a reward to the nobles who had signed up as crusaders. By 1215, they'd mostly crushed the Cathars. There was a small revolt which led to more clashes in 1225, but that was the end of it. They put that down pretty brutally. So this crusade played a large part in creating the Dominicans, the Dominican order, and they led the Inquisition of the church against heretics. They're infamous for that. So by the mid-14th century, the Cathars were wiped out. So it wasn't until, it took, the worst of it was in 20 years, but it actually took about 100 years to really completely get rid of the belief system. The Albigensian Crusade is considered an act of genocide, in large part due to out of control local militias and mobs. It led to the increased strength of the French monarchy. It helped to create the Avignon papacy, which is when the Pope moved out of Rome and moved to Avignon. It's a whole thing. Between 1309 and 1376, 7 different popes moved headquarters to Avignon in France and not to Rome. It's often been referred to as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. So that's the horrible end of the Cathars, who were peaceful, non-military, vegetarian, very philosophical, believers in the message of Jesus in the Bible as an allegorical expression of philosophical ideas. They believed in reincarnation. They had very peaceful communities, if I remember correctly. Men and women were equal. They were a little kind of hippie-esque, they were all into casual relationships, I'll put it that way. It was an interesting ideology, an interesting group. They did not seek out this confrontation other than not being afraid to speak against corruption and hypocrisy. So, one man's heretic is another man's truth teller. So that's all I have to say about July. That's the big event in July in history. I'm sure there were others, but that's the one that really struck me as very important for us to pay attention to. So go back and look at the video that I made about the Cathars not too long ago, within the last year. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. Let me know if you guys have topics you'd like me to cover. I'm more than happy to consider it. And thanks for watching. Slán go fóill, slánte.